Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin. Now, Rosemary's Baby was published in 1967, and this was later adapted into the 1968 film of the same name by Roman Polanski. Now, I'll talk more about the film adaptation and the elephant in the room who directed it in the second half of this video. Now, Ira Levin would go on to write books like The Stepford Wives, which is a very similarly themed novel, and The Boys from Brazil. Now, I actually already reviewed this book back in 2013, and that review is still up, however it's no longer public. It's now marked as unlisted, but I'll leave a link in the description below to where you could check out my 2013 review of Rosemary's Baby. I just wanted to reread the book and re-review it, mainly because I feel like there's so much more I can say about the book. But Rosemary's Baby, I'm sure it's been said before about this book, but this is an excellent novel, and there's a reason this book has kind of spawned the legacy that it did, because in my opinion, this really is one of the most important horror novels of the 20th century. Now, this novel is very much a product of its time, because the 60s was really sort of the beginning of the whole women's liberation movement, where women's rights, and especially women's reproductive rights, were rightfully so being taken a lot more seriously, and women's reproductive rights are definitely at the forefront of this novel, and the book also definitely has sort of a feminist undercurrent where it really is sort of a critique of gender roles and misogyny. And the book is also very much a commentary on the state of religion at the time, because the 1960s really was sort of the first time in America where the church and the very concept of God was really being called into question, and you definitely see that in this novel. So it's very much a novel of its time, yet it also feels very timeless, because besides the fact that it is definitely set in the 60s, there's really not a lot in the book that really dates it, other than sort of the treatment of women, but the book is supposed to be a condemnation of the ways in which women are treated in our society. But to me, the creepiest aspect of Rosemary's Baby is not the supernatural stuff at all. It's the idea that all the people you think are your friends are actually conspiring against you. That to me is the scariest idea of this story. And it's also very much a story about gaslighting and abuse, and really it's the story of a woman who doesn't realize it, but is basically being inducted into a cult. So, the plot of Rosemary's Baby is it's about this young woman named Rosemary Woodhouse who moves into this apartment building called the Branford with her husband Guy, who is a struggling actor. They move in despite warnings from Rosemary's friend, who claims that the building has a very unpleasant history of murders, suicides, and even satanic rituals. But Rosemary and Guy, of course, don't take his warning very seriously. But later on, Rosemary befriends this young woman named Terry, who is a former drug addict who was taken in by Rosemary and Guy's neighbors, this kindly old couple called the Castevets. But shortly afterwards, Terry ends up committing suicide, and Rosemary and Guy end up becoming friends with the Castevets, and Guy especially becomes really close with them. But eventually in the story, Rosemary ends up pregnant, and the Castevets and the Castevets' friends seem to take a special interest in Rosemary's Baby. And they recommend this doctor to her, but the doctor outright tells her, don't take pills, don't read books, and don't listen to your friends. And every day they start giving her this strange drink, and she starts feeling this severe pain, and basically this pregnancy is taking a physical and mental toll on Rosemary. And the doctor and the Castevets and Guy are all like, oh no, that's normal, but when her friends see her, her friends are like, what the fuck? That's not normal at all. Pregnant women aren't supposed to look and feel like that. And it becomes very apparent that something is not right about Rosemary's pregnancy, and throughout the story she starts to believe that her neighbors and even her own husband are part of a satanic cult who want to use her baby for their own sinister purposes. Now, this is where I'm going to get into some major spoilers, but the book is over 50 years old at this point, and I think at this point most people kind of know what's actually going on with Rosemary's Baby. But earlier on in the novel, before Rosemary becomes pregnant, there's a scene where she's apparently drugged, and while she's drugged, she has this horrific nightmare, or what appears to be a nightmare, where she's actually raped by Satan himself. But then in the morning, when she wakes up, she sees all these scratches on her, and then Guy says, "Oh, I basically had my way with you last night while you were passed out," which is still pretty fucked up, because even if Satan wasn't involved at all, he basically does admit to marital rape in that scene. But basically, at the end of the novel, you find out that her baby was literally the child of Satan. And this cult has orchestrated this pregnancy as a way to usher in the era of the Antichrist. Now, Rosemary's Baby, very much like The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, is a supernatural horror story that feels very much grounded in reality. Like, all the supernatural stuff that happens in this novel really only happens in dream sequences, adding this real layer of ambiguity to it all. And it helps that Rosemary is actually a really likable protagonist who you definitely feel for throughout the course of the novel, because even if there's nothing supernatural going on in the story at all, it's so clear throughout this book that she's definitely being gaslighted, and just the emotional and mental abuse she endures in this novel is really kind of painful to read about. And Guy, her husband, is such a fucking prick. Like, I know people would probably argue that Roman Castevet is the main villain of the story, but in my personal opinion, Guy is the true villain of this novel. Like, Guy's abuse towards Rosemary is a much more subtle abuse, where he doesn't yell at her and he doesn't hit her, but it's definitely abuse that he puts her through. Now, you find out by the end of the story that he does have his reasons for doing what he's doing, but it's still pretty fucked up. And he does speak to her like she's a child, despite the fact that she's shown to be a pretty intelligent woman, and he also treats her like she's his property. Now, of course, his reason for doing this is because he's made a deal with the devil to get famous, but part of that deal is he has to let the devil rape his wife so she could birth the Antichrist. So he sells out his wife for personal gain, and this is also where you could definitely see the feminist theme of the story, where the villains of the story are all these older people, and mostly men, who are trying to take control of this woman's body, and are trying to have a say with what happens in her pregnancy. So again, I do think Guy is a far more despicable character than the Castevets, because at least the Castevets, they're practicing their religion, whereas Guy doesn't really give a shit about their religion. He just wants to get famous, and again, he's using Rosemary as the chip in his Faustian contract. Now, another point in the story where you could definitely see the feminist theme is there's a certain point where Rosemary is having a party at their apartment, and she invites all of hers and Guy's old friends, and some of her friends are in the kitchen with her, and they're talking to her about how her pregnancy is not normal, and Rosemary's crying, and they're telling her to drop this doctor that she has, and when she tells Guy about this, Guy's like, "Oh, what were those not very bright bitches filling your head with?" So that's another sort of critique on misogyny that you see in the book. Especially because you could tell that Rosemary's friends are definitely more liberated women. So yeah, throughout the book, I just wanted to punch this Guy, no pun intended, in the back of the head. But to be fair, there are points in the story where Guy is actually very charming, and you can see where somebody like Rosemary would fall for somebody like Guy. Now, one thing that's interesting to note is the book is primarily set in the years 1965 and 1966. 1966 was also the year that Anton LaVey established the Church of Satan, and I don't think that was a coincidence. I think Ira Levin definitely set this book in 1966 on purpose to sort of tie in with all that. And the book is very much making a commentary on the state of religion in the modern world. As I pointed out before, the 1960s really was the first time in America where the concept of God was really being called into question. Like, towards the beginning of the novel, there's a certain point where the Pope is visiting New York City, and Roman Castevet, and this is before you find out that he's a Satanist, but he points out all the hypocrisy of organized religion, and truth be told, even though I do personally believe in a God, I don't entirely disagree with him with a lot of the things he says about organized religion. But later on at the party, one of the guests at Rosemary's party does bring up this theory that God has literally died. And then later on, there's a scene in a doctor's office where Rosemary picks up a copy of Time magazine that asks the question, "Is God dead?" which was actually a real headline at the time. And I think Ira Levin is sort of playing around with this idea that this widespread crisis of faith is sort of ushering in the era of Satan, but he does it in a way where it doesn't come off as preachy. Now, you could read the ending of this book as being very nihilistic, because by the end of it, it's very much implied that Satan has won out over God, and also it's implied that this child will eventually bring about the apocalypse. But there's a strange positivity to the ending where when Rosemary finally accepts this as her child, she's empowered. She's empowered in ways that she never was in her marriage to Guy. And it is implied that she'll secretly work against the Satanists by raising the child the way she wants to, not the way the Satanists want her to, and she might try to turn her son away from all that. And by the end, she accepts this child not for God and not for Satan, but for herself. And when she does this, it's actually a really empowering moment, especially the scene where all the members of this cult start chanting "Hail Rosemary." So again, by the end, it's very much ambiguous as to whether or not this is a positive ending or a bleak ending. Now, one thing that's interesting is in the book it refers to Satanists as witches, and to the best of my knowledge, actual witchcraft has nothing to do with Satanism whatsoever, but I can't really blame Ira Levin for that, because that's a mistake that's been made for hundreds of years now. But yeah, if you haven't read Rosemary's Baby, I know I've spoiled a lot of it, but if you haven't read this book, you owe it to yourself to check this out. It is an excellent horror novel. Now, Ira Levin in the 90s actually wrote a sequel to this novel called Son of Rosemary, and I've heard both good and bad about that book. Now, before I talk about the Roman Polanski film, I want to cut to a short review on this book done by my friend Mark Allen Gunnels, who is actually an author himself, and he's a regular guest in my videos.
So my friend Christian has asked me to do a review of the novel Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin. First-rate novel. Absolutely wonderful and exquisite. I think most people, because of the movie that was made by Roman Polanski, are familiar with the story of the pregnant woman who starts to believe that the people who live in her building are a satanic cult, and that there may be some connection with her child. What I think Levin does so wonderfully that makes the novel really work is that he grounds it in a very realistic world. Rosemary and her husband Guy, they're just very everyday people. You feel like you know them. When they move into the building, everyone seems very real and authentic. And so that when he starts layering in the supernatural stuff, it's so much more effective because it's being built on top of a foundation of realism and authenticity. I mean, he describes things in such detail that it makes the world seem almost mundane, but I don't mean that in a bad way. He does that because it feels familiar. It feels like you know the world. And, so there's just everyday things happening, just the day-to-day chores and tasks you do. And so that when the horror starts coming in, it's that much more effective because you really have this grounding of realism that makes everything work better.
Now, Rosemary's Baby was adapted into a film of the same name in 1968, which was actually produced by William Castle, the same William Castle who directed films like House on Haunted Hill and The Tingler. And the movie was written and directed by Roman Polanski, and the film is considered to be the second of Polanski's Apartment trilogy, which is sort of a trilogy of unconnected films that all have to do with apartment buildings in some way. The first film of this trilogy was Polanski's 1965 film Repulsion, and the third film of the trilogy was his 1976 film The Tenant. Now, the same way that I said the novel might be one of the most important horror novels of the 20th century, I think the movie Rosemary's Baby is probably one of the most important horror films of its time. And I think it's interesting how it came out the same year as George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, because both these films, while being completely different, are both perfect encapsulations of the time period they came out. And both films really did sort of revolutionize the horror genre, and Rosemary's Baby, along with Night of the Living Dead, and then later films like The Exorcist and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween, really did sort of set the template for modern horror as we know it now. Now, Rosemary's Baby is a movie that I did not appreciate when I first saw it, but keep in mind I first saw the movie when I was 11 years old. At that age, I heard that the movie was about a demon baby, so I was expecting something like It's Alive. So when I saw that the film was a lot more mature than that, at that age I was very much disappointed, but later on I ended up reading the book and then seeing the movie again, and now I appreciate the film for the masterpiece that it is. And the movie is remarkably faithful to the book, like it's almost a scene-for-scene and word-for-word adaptation. But the movie does remove that final sequence in the book where the cult members start shouting out, "Hell, Rosemary." Like, it cuts away right before that scene was supposed to have happened, which I thought was kind of a mistake, given what the themes of the story are. But in the film, you had Mia Farrow as Rosemary, and she did an amazing job in that movie. You also had John Cassavetes as Guy Woodhouse, and he really did nail Guy's smugness and just his douchebaggish nature, but at the same time, very much like in the book, there are points where Guy is actually very charming, and you can understand why somebody like Rosemary would be attracted to somebody like Guy. Then you had Sidney Blackmere as Roman Castevet and Ruth Gordon as his wife Minnie, and both of them did great jobs in the movie as well. And then you had the film's score, like that creepy as hell lullaby that's actually sung by Mia Farrow in the beginning of the film. Now, of course you can't talk about a Roman Polanski movie without also talking about all the controversy surrounding Roman Polanski. Of course, Roman Polanski is, rightfully so, a very controversial and very polarizing figure. Now, yes, I know Roman Polanski did have a lot of tragedy in his life. He survived the Holocaust, and at the time he made Rosemary's Baby, he was married to Sharon Tate, who would later be murdered by members of the Manson family in what is arguably one of the most horrific murders in American history. So, when it comes to Roman Polanski, I feel horrible for the child he once was who witnessed all that in Europe, and I feel horrible for the husband who lost his wife and his unborn child, but where I lose all sympathy for Polanski is the fact that years after his wife was murdered, he ended up drugging and raping a 13-year-old girl, and then fled the country like a little bitch. And yes, I know if you look into it, there was some corruption on the part of the prosecution, but it still doesn't make it any better. He's still a piece of shit in my eyes, and while I do like his movies, there's no way I can condone what he did. He's still a garbage human being. But to go back to the movie itself and forgetting about what a pig of a man the director is, Rosemary's Baby is an excellent movie, and it's a great adaptation of the book. Now, I already mentioned that years later, Ira Levin wrote a sequel to the novel Rosemary's Baby, but the movie Rosemary's Baby actually had a made-for-TV sequel in 1976 called Look What Happened to Rosemary's Baby. And I've heard mostly bad things about that movie. I do know that Ruth Gordon is apparently the only cast member from the first movie to actually reprise her role in that film. And then there was actually a miniseries adaptation of Rosemary's Baby in 2014, and I've heard both good and bad about that movie. Now, of course, both the book and the movie had a huge influence on later films like The Brotherhood of Satan and The Devil's Reign, and even movies like The Omen or The Sentinel probably wouldn't exist if not for Rosemary's Baby. And actually, Jordan Peele said that both Rosemary's Baby and The Stepford Wives were a huge influence on his movie Get Out, but whereas The Stepford Wives and Rosemary's Baby very much dealt with gender, that movie very much dealt with race. And you could also see the Rosemary's Baby influence on movies like Hereditary and even Midsommar. Now, before I end this video, I want to cut back to my friend Mark Allen Gunnels giving his thoughts on the movie Rosemary's Baby, and then I want to cut to my friend Christian Feliciano giving his thoughts on the movie. Now, Christian did read the book, but he said he remembered more of the movie than the book, so instead of giving me a review on both the book and the movie, he just gave me a short review on the movie.
The movie version is also exquisite. It is one of the most faithful adaptations I've ever seen. It almost is the novel on film, right down to outfits people are wearing, how a room is furnished, and the performances, particularly Mia Farrow as Rosemary, are just exquisite. I think the film is a classic. Now, years later, Ira Levin wrote a sequel novel called Son of Rosemary, and we will not speak of that. That's all I'm going to say, that we should not speak of it. But yeah, Rosemary's Baby is a classic novel made into a classic film. Love it.
I remember when I was a kid, I kept asking this person, who I won't name, to watch the movie Rosemary's Baby. But I didn't say Rosemary's Baby because I didn't know the name Rosemary's Baby. I just knew the movie as the one where the woman gives birth to the devil's child. And I kept saying, I want to watch that movie where the woman gives birth to the devil's child because I had seen scenes from it in a documentary or something there that I was watching on TV. And I was like, oh, I want to watch that because I loved horror films. Ever since I've been really little. I mean, one of the first films I ever saw, I don't remember it watching it for the first time, but I know for a fact that one of the first films I ever saw was American Werewolf in London. So I've just been in love with horror, and I really wanted to watch this movie. So I kept saying I want to watch the one with where the woman gives birth to the devil's baby. And they thought I was talking about The Omen. So they rented The Omen, and we watched it. And yes, I enjoyed The Omen. It's a great film. I really loved it. But I was like, this is not the movie I was talking about. I'm talking about the one where the woman gives birth to the devil's baby. Because if you really look at The Omen, the woman doesn't give birth to the devil's baby. So that's a whole different plot. Anyway, whatever. The point is, Rosemary's Baby is one of the greatest films in existence. It is beautifully directed and beautifully written, beautifully shot. It is beautifully acted. It is one of the greatest horror films, one of the greatest films of all time. It's a masterpiece. It deserves as much respect as it gets. Yes, there is a very, very colorful elephant in the room about its director, Roman Polanski. I will not discuss that at all. I'm just going to acknowledge it and just move on. You can tell that Jacob's Ladder was inspired by this a little bit, especially with the dream sequence that happens in this film where basically the devil's baby is being conceived. You could tell that kind of feels like a Jacob's Ladder scene, and that's just really, really demented, and it's disturbing, and it's shocking, but it's beautifully shot. It just keeps you interested. No matter how disturbing this movie can get at times, it keeps you interested. And then, of course, it gets really spooky when they get into the cult mentality of the people around the main character. You know, when you get around the people around her, the cult mentality of this, and what's actually happening, you find out how ritualistic all the events in this movie are. It reminds you of Hereditary, what's happening, you know, in the new movie Hereditary. And it's just really, really good. It's beautiful. I love this film. Dialogue is on point. Everything is great. I read the book years ago. I don't remember how close the book is to the movie, so I can't really discuss that. But there is a reason why, if you tell people that there's a book about Rosemary's Baby, they go, "Oh, I didn't know that." It's because this movie is so good. It's not to put down the book. You know, the book was great. I remember enjoying it. But it's just that this is a great film. It's like The Godfather. It's another one where it's just as good as the book, sometimes better. You know, I think, in my personal opinion, I think the movie Godfather is better than the book. And there are a few other movies out there that I think the movie is better than the book. But this, to me, might be one of the examples. I got to read the book again, I really do. But just at this point, the fact that I've seen the movie several times and I've only read the book once years ago, shows that I, you know, obviously preferred the movie. So yeah, I highly recommend this movie. It's great. It is one of the greatest, like I said, of all time, and definitely check it out. I know there is that very colorful elephant in the room about its director. I know it's there, and I can see it. I'm choosing to ignore it. I'm actually looking to the right, and it's on my left. But if you can get past that and just look at the movie as a piece of film, and you don't worry about the outside stuff about it, you can really enjoy it. And if not, you know, that's up to you. But I highly recommend you give it a shot, because Rosemary's Baby is fantastic. And yeah, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
But I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you enjoyed this video overall. That was my review on Rosemary's Baby by Ira Levin, and bye.